Hello and most welcome to 1737 of the Heidegger series. And we will today finish off the article Wittgenstein and Psychology by Daniel D. Hutto. We are currently at page 14. We're talking about scientisms and how we look for a scientific explanation of mind, or that we look for explanation in itself. Could maybe make it a little bit smaller, just a tad, yeah. And how that has led to the new concept of mind that Fisher argues in his book from 2011, a text that we will look closely into later on. And he sees that the new mind, the mechanical mind, if you like, is a rather new invention. Hardly older than the rise of Newtonian physics. Comes together with the rise of British empiricism. And it is thought of as a container of mental things, wherein everything is stored, and it is on the inside of this container. Everything is engraved. Those things are copies of what has happened, or things that we previously thought about. And of course, when the computer developed in the 20th century, even more fuel went into this way of seeing things. A storage room situated on the inside of the skull, and the brain as the engraving instrument or storage facility. And only indirectly it can reach out to the outsideness. An outsideness that is completely parted from the insideness. So as it, in the end, almost have no connection to the outsideness at all. There's no truth, no facts, and we have reductionism and its brother, relativism. This is eerily close to Merleau-Ponty and Stephen M. Rosen's subject in front of space, looking at object. Both the subject and the object become predominantly passive in this approach. Not participating in anything in particular. And such weird and almost scary, I would say scary, mind games were constructed, like rain in the vat. I think that in itself can send a person into years of nightmares. It is most definitely shockingly outwardly. And it leads to an alienation and a dependency of others, experts, to tell them what is out there, what is that outsideness which they have no contact with. And that especially approach can partly be called scientism. It betroths enormous power to scientists, experts, and making people become dependent on second-hand or fourth-hand information bits, so-called factoids. Very good name, factoids. I do like it. But we are distanced from the source of knowledge, from reality itself. We have only contact to the signs, so to speak, not to the hidden, signified, somewhere transcendently existing. But also the inner side is mostly hidden, out of view, out of reach for our knowing selves. We can continue where we left off in 1733. And we are currently on the third paragraph, beginning with once. Once the perceiving thinking analogy was firmly in place, these characteristic framework ideas came to be treated as obviously true by philosophers at the time. And yet, as Fisher emphasizes, they are clearly not part of common sense. Instead, they are distinctively philosophical. And at the time, fresh intuitions shared without explicit argument by many early modern thinkers. What might explain this? Ironically, Fisher calls on psychology to do interesting work for philosophy at this juncture. In this respect, Fisher goes beyond Wittgenstein to try to give a deeper account of why we are prone to certain philosophical pictures. In this vein, he claims, a thinker is under the spell of or adheres to a philosophical picture if and only if he systematically makes non-intentional analogical inferences to which assimilates targets to models of a conceptual metaphor in ways the thinker knows them to be different. Furthermore, Fisher maintains that non-intentional analogical inferences lead to conclusions that the thinkers who make them are prone to find intuitively compelling. Hence, once a thinker falls under the spell of an analogy-sponsored picture, we can expect musty ways of thinking to take over. We can expect thinkers to find certain things to be absolutely obvious and necessarily so, and that such conclusions can be established without argument. Indeed, without even the possibility of argument. By embracing a picture by means of unnoticed analogical thinking, common but otherwise apparently inexplicable intuitions can be generated. Hence, if Fisher's proposed explanation holds good, a conceptual metaphor can suggest suitable models to speakers of a language. Text, if it can come up a bit. Yet calling on psychological theorizing once again, Fisher further augments this analysis by holding that once picture-driven reasoning has led us to a philosophical conception, belief bias effects may have us read this conception into ordinary talk. Whatever Wittgenstein might have made of Fisher's attempts to explain what lies behind picture-driven theorizing, both agree that the sorts of attachments to certain philosophical pictures and the problems that arise from picture-driven reasoning cannot be solved by finding deeper explanations. Rather, they can only be dissolved by means of systematic treatment. A telltale sign that the thinker is in the thrall of such picture-driven thinking is that absolute conviction the thinker exhibits about the truth of various conclusions persists even in the face of contradictions that are thrown up by such convictions. As acknowledged by the thinker themselves. In the case in point, those prone to excessively assimilate thinking to visual perception find it irresistible to conclude that if thinking about something does not involve seeing something located in our environment, then it must involve seeing something located within us. Hence, the positing of inner acts of perception that target inner mental objects. Of course, to the idea that acts of perceiving really takes place in our heads flies in the face of other things we find ordinarily obvious about perceiving. Such as the fact that perceiving is something that happens out in the open in relation to public objects, such as our seeing a sunset. And that, given the public character, such acts of perceiving can be shared by others. It would take too long to spell out all the difficulties that the inner container picture of mind generates. But for our purposes here, it suffices to note as Fodor's analysis reveals, that despite many noteworthy modifications, that is, moving away from the idea that there is literally a mind's eye that views mental objects. Many contemporary theorists in the sciences of mind still embrace core elements of this venerable philosophical picture. For example, they are deeply committed to the idea that there literally are mental objects and processes that can be the objects of scientific investigation. To the extent that psychology remains attached even to these core remnants of the early modern empiricist picture of mind in a fundamental way, it is falling into a trap that lay in our language. For without a doubt, that picture gives life to unargued for, unshakable foundational convictions and intuitions about what must be the case when it comes to thinking about the mind. The point is that to the extent that such convictions and intuitions are operative in psychological theorizing, given their ancestry, they are neither products of pure, untainted scientific theorizing, nor unproblematic snippets of common sense. Rather, they have their origins in analogies that arose from a certain way of philosophizing about the nature of the mind. The resultant cocktail is one that assigns picture-inspired properties to mental objects. As constructed within a specific philosophical theory. And these are then presumptuously imposed from without on today's sciences of the mind. More to the point, for all its vaunted explanatory power, insisting on the existence of underlying, yet to be fully understood, mental objects and processes with special properties turns out to be just as Wittgenstein might have anticipated, to provide little insight into the nature of minds. Indeed, we are told thinking, intentionality, concept possession, and concept individuation really are all deeply mysterious. And they really cannot be allowed indefinitely to take in one another's wash. The hardness of understanding intentionality and thought isn't these days as widely advertised as the hardness of understanding consciousness. But it's quite hard enough to be getting on with. The truly committed who feel the force of these seemingly intractable mysteries remain hopeful that the answers will eventually come one day. Whatever one makes of such optimism, the interesting question is what makes such thinkers commit to the idea that an answer of a particular sort must be on the cards. This is as clear a case as any in which philosophers feel compelled, due to the attachment to a picture of mind, to posit the existence of queer mental object and processes while leaving their natures undecided. Wittgenstein is not anti-science. What he does reject is the seductive scientific view that the scientific method and outlook should dominate all thinking, that all problems and questions reduced to scientific ones in particular, if the scientific method is not appropriate for dealing with philosophical problems of the sort that arise from conceptual confusions, then making new discoveries or acquiring deeper knowledge of phenomena through the manufacture of more elaborate theories cannot possibly solve or address them. Conclusion. For Wittgenstein, our philosophical labor does not add to our compendium of knowledge. It yields neither scientific knowledge nor a special kind of non-scientific knowledge. It elucidates and clarifies. By putting to bed, or at least temporarily controlling certain misleading habits of thought, we can get clear our genuine conceptual commitments when thinking about psychology. Those that are integral to our everyday practices. This can be achieved on a case-by-case basis by appealing to examples that reveal the point, context, and specific character of our familiar modes of thought and talk. The positive part of philosophical work is the assembly of reminders about the contexts in which we actually deploy our concepts. The role such concepts play in our practices and the point of such practices. But this kind of work is only possible if we can free ourselves from tempting but misleading pictures that systematically block our view of how we might use our psychological concepts. Possible uses that lie before us in plain view if we only have the eyes and will to see them. And this ends Daniel de Hutto's Wittgenstein and Psychology. And I will go for some memorable quotes. See later if there's time for another text. If we go back, may so, to page 14. I will start even a little bit earlier than we ended. For repetition, that's in the second paragraph. And do remember that, because it is very helpful. It's just a phrase that we get a new concept of mind as a kind of container of a mental happenings was first forged, displacing as a kind of container, yes, of mental happenings. Was first forged, displacing the previously dominant Aristotelian conception of mind. That is of enormous importance, and it's also quite interesting. I'd say this is a shared conclusion with the British neurologist, doctor, scientist Ian McGilchrist. And to make it even more spicy, this view dominated all thinking since. Complete dominance. It was seen, as we can see in the next paragraph. Go down to the next, at the end of it. Instead, they are distinctly philosophical and at the time fresh intuitions shared without explicit argument by many early modern thinkers. It became enormously strong. In my own subjects, linguistics, science of cognition, neurology, philosophy, it was the unquestionable foundation of all discussions, all papers, all teaching, and all the books that we encountered. There were no exceptions. It could be interesting now to see that this is actually a most new tendency in the history of thought. It turns up. It felt like a freshness, a change of the winds. And of course, we are talking enlightenment, the radically, completely alien new philosophy that we constantly rely on. The next quote is rather difficult, so let me try to analyze it. The next paragraph also comes from Fisher. A thinker is under the spell of or adheres to a philosophical picture if and only if he systematically makes non-intentional, and that's the important phrase here, non-intentional analogical inferences which assimilates targets to models of a conceptual metaphor in ways the thinker knows them to be different. This will take a little bit of struggle. Non-intentional as the automatic system, for instance, of Saussure. Glad we have that established already. Because in his world, the signified is always non-intentionally or observer-free connected to the sign. So it's automatic. You can also call it passive, but it's more than that. It's deterministic. The connection between car and what it signifies, the car, if you like. And this is new. And this is something Saussure himself was under the spell of, that ruled his philosophy. Same goes for Levi-Strauss and all analytical philosophy. And if we read further in Fisher, non-intentional analogical inferences lead to conclusions that the thinkers who make them are prone to find intuitively compelling. Also a tough one. Ian Cowler often mentions the original in this odd new way that comes with the 17th century. This original is what you want to find maybe in a Bible text or an archaeological remnant, to, without the observer, remember non-intentional, take away the observer. The observer has no finger in the game. He's not participatory, and he shouldn't be participatory even, I would say. And once we find such a thinking original, it can be also the pure idea or the truth. Yourself and others will find them intuitively compelling. You would say, yeah, maybe phrase you could use, they are objective. The nasty finger of a bad translator is not there, or an interpreter. And that's why we get this uniformity of thinking, or a very important, the perceived uniformity of thinking, something that Wittgenstein shows not to be there. It's a fixation of what could be called an original, but it's just a mistake. And then we continue by embracing a picture by means of unnoticed, mention that, see that? It's not noticed, you're not even aware of it. Analogical thinking, common but otherwise apparently inexplicable. Intuitions can be generated. And I'll just read the rest. Hence, if Fischer's proposed explanation holds good, a conceptual metaphor can suggest suitable models to speakers of language. And listen now. Yet it should be clear that the source of such philosophical intuitions, or at least in the case in question, does not stem from ordinary uses of language. What does that mean? Well, they simply do not work. We do not get closer to the truth by looking for the original. It is based on a false picture of the world where our thinking objects are locked into the container of a head, and the outsideness is where we need to find the original for those, what can we call them, thinking objects. This is the illusion that truly Bernard and Jacques Monod and François Jacob were under, which they could not themselves be aware of. It's under the surface, and it evolves in the 17th, 18th century. And if we continue on the next paragraph, take directly to the site from Fischer. Once picture-driven reasoning has led us to a philosophical conception. Belief bias effects may have us read this conception into ordinary talk. We start believing that these things, search for the original, or this truth with a big T, is in normal use of language, that it has some strength to it. I think that's the last leg of the establishment of the illusion. And then we get these philosophical problems like what is the original, and what would happen if we take the brain out of the body and put it in a bowl of water. All these conclusions are widely unnatural in language. They're just paradoxes per se, not to show paradoxes, but made to be paradoxes. And if we go even further down at the last bit of the third paragraph, and it's an earlier mentioned, contradictions doesn't matter anymore to the objectivist or the monosemic person. This is my explanation. We ignore paradoxes. It can be as mad as possible. And then, of course, the last sentence of that rather longish paragraph. Of course, to the idea that acts of perceiving really takes place in our heads, flies in the face of other things we ordinarily obvious about, we find ordinarily obvious about perceiving, such as the fact that perceiving is something that happens out in the open in relation to public objects, such as seeing the sunset, and that given that public characters, such acts of perceiving can be shared with others. So this picture-driven visual objects theory doesn't allow things to be shared. They don't have a public character. They are hidden in the private language. So it doesn't go hand in hand with common sense. And it strangled neurology, science of cognition until recently. These picture-driven tendencies are completely gone in the science of cognition. It's gone. Nobody thinks anymore that there are visual objects inside their head, and the head is a container for that sort of depict the outsideness. But it took 300 years, and this is what has been attacked by or deconstructed by Derrida and destructed by Heidegger. But here it becomes even clearer what's behind the driving force of it, so to speak. And if we go to the next paragraph, to the extent at the end of it, and it also affects psychology, which is obviously the point of this very article. To the extent that psychology remains attached even to these core remnants of the early modern empiricist picture of mind, in a fundamental way, it is falling into a trap that lay in our language. For without a doubt, that picture gives life to unargued for, unshakable foundational convictions and intuitions about what must be the case when it comes to thinking about the mind. Well, if you don't know about it, you are ruled by it. Everything you discuss, conclude, your whole logic will be driven by the picture. It will tell what's right and wrong. And this is why it's gone so far, strangling these different sciences as neurology, science of cognition, psychology, and so forth. The point is that, and I continue in the very last paragraph here, I think we'll be enough with this text today. The point is that to the extent that such convictions and intuitions are operative in psychological theorizing, giving their ancestry, they are neither products of pure, untainted scientific theorizing, nor unproblematic snippets of common sense. Rather, they have their origins in the analogies that arose from a certain way of philosophizing about the nature of the mind. So we are under the spell of the mental objects. And these mental objects, as you can see the next line, just as Wittgenstein might have anticipated, to provide little insight into the nature of minds. And then there's a quote from Fodor where he admits that we will never, or it will take centuries before we understand anything about mind. So it's a track that doesn't lead to anything of a solution nor an understanding. I think that's extremely true in linguistics, where that turn sadly is still not made, still stuck there in the idea of representationalism, monosemism, and so forth, which of course strengthens the development. I've been talking enough here. Let's Kalle come in here now, please.
Okay, so this paper is very anti-picture. For instance, the last phrase, misleading pictures. But Wittgenstein himself uses pictures like the famous rabbit and duck picture.
Yes.
So the difference is, the point seems to be in this paper is that these pictures like the rabbit and duck, in psychology, you assume that this picture is not out in the world, but it's only in your head. And let's say I understand the picture as a duck, then it's correct, and you understand as a rabbit, then it's then you say it's rabbit, but the picture itself is not in the world. And then psychology would would try to go deep in my thinking, what in my childhood caused me to deduce that the picture is, I interpret the picture as a duck. Or how do you understand it, Hans?
This is absolutely correct, Kalle. Very good. Thank you very much. This is why, one of the reasons why the ambigram of the duck rabbit is used, because it will make us ask the question, what inside of me makes me see a rabbit and not a duck, or vice versa? Exactly. Very good. Very good. Start looking for an insideness, as Saussure did. What is inside of us that has some contents that makes the sign be connected to a car or rabbit or duck? Paradoxical. You can never ever come to a conclusion. You will never ever find an answer going that way. I think. Obviously proven by science of cognition and psychology.
So let me take up another topic here. The word hypothesis, for instance. It was in connection with Freud, or we could even discuss Freud in general and his take. So Freud is mentioned 7 times in this paper. This is the abominable mess that you see here. So the criticism was that Freud misinterprets the word hypothesis. science, in so to say, in real science, hypothesis is a conjecture, perhaps, but for Freud, it's the origin. Do I understand it correctly, Hans?
Yes. One could also say it in even more colloquial terms and say that obviously Freud becomes victim of that picture as well. For you listening in, and Kalle, of course, I will deliver the best description of that picture in the next lecture. It was actually made by Horridge.
Horridge, okay.
But you'll have to wait for it. I need to ascertain it myself. So one could also say that the picture in some ways is a misconception.
But if we try to defend Freud, so to say that you're an adult, let's say that many traumas go back to the childhood, say your father abused you or whatever, and these are seen as a reasonable explanations, and we know that if you have a good harmonious childhood, then it's likely that you will develop into a good person, so to say, without traumas.
Yes.
But where did Freud go wrong?
Well, part of the problem is what Freud takes out to do is not only explain, but to help. And he's using the scientific method. And there's where he fails. The trauma doesn't disappear, as he calls it. Establishing the trauma makes it a fact and untenable, impossible to move.
I don't really get it. So let's say that somebody had a horrible incident in his childhood, and this caused a terrible trauma. So here Freud would be right. He has to go back to the childhood.
Well, he delivers an explanation that I don't remember Freud completely, but the explanation is sexual need for the mother and wanting to kill one's own father, and going into that will sort of cure the patients. And this is always the case. But I think the trauma thing is not something that really Freud would agree with. It came later on when I think people realized it doesn't really work with this Oedipus complex and so forth.
Yes, of course. Freud was much more specific. It was like, as you said, it was about, everything was really about sexuality for Freud.
Yes, and the explanations, not even with trauma, are helpful. Today, if somebody's suffering, maybe from a, let's say, PTSD, they don't use explanations. Instead, they try to shape and alter behavior, which is much more Wittgensteinian. And that works actually to a certain degree. We must remember Wittgenstein is not anti-science at all. It is rather this picture-driven, unexplained, never proposed, never acknowledged tendency that takes us into the wrong path in science. So what we do will not be successful or will not work, as, for instance, Freud.
Yes, indeed. And when I now think about it, and how this on the first page here on Hutto's paper, he mentions Horvitz. Or was it on the second page? Second page. Yes. So everybody does this mistake in point one.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Scientism, that there is always an original cause to everything.
Yes, we start asking the question, we need an explanation. And we can always get an explanation, but is it a good way of doing things? Is it normal, or is it real? And that's the problem.
Yes, because say accidents are also behind great discoveries that as we have discovered, as we have discussed, and accidents are not there waiting for us to make.
Yeah.
So accidents. And we always assume there is always universal laws. I think that is also the mistake that lies behind this, that the universal laws that always are valid, unchangeable.
Yes, exactly. The cosmological fallacy has more or less been shown to be causing problems in physics, but it's stemming from the same picture that Freud and all others are under, or were under.
Yes, and this thinking, okay, you can allow for little variation in the beginning of universe.
Kalle, a bit slower and lower, please.
In this paradigm, you can allow for little variation in the beginning, but only in the very beginning. Like in the Big Bang, but then, okay, a little bit variation in the beginning, but then everything is immutable.
Yes, exactly. It's immutable. Definitely.
Only after the little first steps. I don't remember now who said that, but we discussed it in May, month of May in Villa Jonsered. So Villa Martinsson Jonsered. There was a scientist who observed that in the beginning there is little variation, but then everything's immutable. Supposedly. So Hans, how many minutes have we? Should we go to next paper or leave it there?
I think I will just make a short look over the whole paper, and that would be enough for this.
Okay.
I should also say to the listeners, this is rather condensed. One could say that Hutto brings all of the good stuff out of Horridge and Fisher. Of course, there's more there, but it's quite condensed. So, but it's good. I really like the list here that Kalle brought out. I think that should be given a special order. The Horridge label, scientism, analogy, generalization. It sort of sums up everything we've been doing. It also shows us some mercy. We realize, and Hutto points this out, that it is not, the picture is not crazy or lunatic. It's so common, it's like our own skin. So it's interesting to see how easy it is to fall for this picture. I think that's maybe one of the most fascinating about the picture. It's so incredibly easy to fall for it. You cannot point finger and say that Wittgenstein was, Freud or Saussure or Jacob or anyone else did a tremendous mistake. Well, mistakes that led to tremendous problems, yes, but not stupid or ignorant exceptions. This picture is so deeply seated, no one mentions it. It is the work of Wittgenstein. Others have been going in that direction, no doubt. They've been in on our lecture series. We have the venerable Heidegger. We of course have Jacques Derrida. I had the metaphor with an elephant. Finding the picture, you could say that Mandelbrot from fractality, quantum mechanics, Terry Mark Starlov, Carlo Rovelli showed from science that problems that unquestioned or unknown picture causes a lot of problem. We have no use for it, but when it's at work, it causes enormous problems. And it makes us prone to accept whatever contradiction that turns out. For instance, brain in the vat, metaphysical philosophical problem. So it hinders us. Wittgenstein is not so much making a philosophical standpoint, but rather he's clearing out the mess so our standpoints can become stronger, clearer, and more actual, so people listen in. The public matter is very important. The very conclusion here, something I really liked. The third line into the conclusion. By putting to bed, not from the bottom, from the start. By putting to bed, or at least temporarily controlling certain misleading habits of thought, we can get clear our genuine conceptual commitments when thinking about psychology, those that are integral to our everyday practices. This can be achieved by, it's in the conclusion at the very end. Yeah, this can be achieved on a case-by-case basis by appeal to examples that reveal the point, context, and specific character of our familiar modes of thought and talk. And the positive part of philosophical work is the assembly of reminders about the context in which we actually deploy our concepts. They will become more workable. They are in our practices. And this is no difference here, for instance, when Christopher Columbus misunderstood the circumference of the Earth and almost made his whole project crashed. You could say his picture of the circumference of the world or the size of the world was a misconception. Learning the correct conception of the world can only be helpful for Columbus. In the same way, this picture only brings things down. It has nothing beneficial to our deployment. I think that's also a pointer. But we will talk about more of that because I have this excellent example. Till next time we do Wittgenstein. It became rather long, maybe. Well, thank you very much, Kalle, for participating. And thank you for your excellent comment there. The first one was with the duck rabbit. I hadn't thought about that, but it's absolutely correct. Because if we have a duck and if we have a rabbit, then according to common, so to speak, common normal sense, we have to have two visual objects, which is itself paradox. Thank you everyone else for joining in. Have a very pleasant morning, day, afternoon, wherever you are. Bye-bye for now, and I stop the recording.